The boy's tears glistened in the fading sunlight. His small fingers curled around the wooden fence post as he wept quietly, unaware that his life was about to change forever. It was 1879 in the harsh territory of Wyoming, where mercy was as scarce as rainfall, and orphans were often left to whatever fate the unforgiving West decided for them. Zachariah Blackwood pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around the animal's hooves. He had been riding since dawn, his cattle drive completed 2 days prior, his pockets heavier with money than they'd been in months. But the sight of the small boy, no more than 6 or 7, sobbing against the fence of what appeared to be an abandoned homestead, made him forget his weariness. "What's troubling you, boy?" Zach called out, his voice gentler than the weathered lines of his face might suggest. The child startled, wiping his nose with a dirty sleeve. His clothes were threadbare, his face smudged with dirt and tears. "They're all gone, sir," he whispered. "Ma passed last winter. Pa and my sisters took the fever 3 days ago." Zach dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a thud. At 32, he'd seen more death than most men twice his age, but the sight of a child left completely alone still pierced his heart. "You got any kin nearby?" he asked, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. The child shook his head, fresh tears welling up. "No, sir. Pa said we had an uncle in California, but I don't know how to find him." Something in Zach's chest tightened. He'd never considered himself father material. His life as a cowboy was too unpredictable, too dangerous. But leaving this child to fend for himself was unthinkable. "What's your name, son?" Zach asked, removing his hat. "Thomas, sir, Thomas Miller." Zach nodded, making his decision. "Well, Thomas, I'm heading to Wildwood Creek. It's a small town about 3 days' ride from here. Got a ranch waiting for me there." He paused, knowing his next words would change both their lives. "Come with me, son, at least until we can find that uncle of yours." Thomas's eyes widened, hope flickering where despair had resided moments before. "You mean it, sir? Call me Zach, and yes, I mean it." He extended his hand. "What do you say?" Thomas hesitated only briefly before placing his small hand in Zach's much larger one. "Yes, Sir Zach, I'll come." Zach helped the boy gather the few belongings he had: a Bible, a small carved wooden horse his father had made, and a daguerreotype of his family. Within the hour, they were riding west, Thomas seated in front of Zach on the saddle, his small body gradually relaxing against the cowboy's chest. As the stars began to appear overhead, Zach realized he'd never felt quite so responsible for another human being before. It terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. 3 days later, they arrived in Wildwood Creek, a town that had sprung up alongside the railroad 10 years prior. It wasn't large, but it had all the necessities: a general store, a saloon, a small schoolhouse, and most importantly for Zach, the land he'd purchased 6 months ago with every penny he'd saved over the past decade. "This is it, Thomas," Zach said as they approached a modest cabin with a barn and corral. It wasn't much, but it was their home now. "It needs some work, but it's ours." "Ours?" Thomas looked up at him with wide eyes. "For as long as you need it to be," Zach assured him, helping the boy down from the horse. The next morning, Zach took Thomas to meet the schoolteacher. The one-room schoolhouse sat on the edge of town, freshly painted white with a small bell tower. As they approached, the door opened, and Zach found himself momentarily speechless. The woman who emerged was unlike any he'd seen in Wildwood Creek. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but a few tendrils had escaped to frame a face that was both strong and delicate. She wore a simple blue dress that couldn't hide her natural grace. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and pleasant. "I don't believe we've met." Zach removed his hat. "Zachariah Blackwood, madam, and this is Thomas. We've just arrived in town. I was hoping he might join your school." She smiled, and something in Zach's chest shifted uncomfortably. "Bridget Anderson," she replied, extending her hand. "I'd be delighted to have a new student." She crouched down to Thomas's level. "Welcome, Thomas. School starts at 8 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning." Thomas nodded shyly, half hiding behind Zach's leg. Zach hesitated, unsure how to explain. He's staying with me for now. His folks passed recently, understanding flickered in Bridget's eyes. I'm very sorry to hear that, Thomas. She looked back up at Zach. Are you his uncle? No, madam, just a friend, I suppose. It sounded inadequate even to his own ears. Bridget's gaze turned appraising but not unkind. Well, Mr. Blackwood, it takes a good man to help a child in need. Thomas will be in good hands here at school, I assure you. As they walked back toward the ranch, Thomas asked, Do I have to go to school? Couldn't I help you with the ranch instead? Zach ruffled the boy's hair. Education's important, Thomas. My pa couldn't read and folks took advantage of him because of it. Besides, he added with a slight smile, Miss Anderson seems nice, don't you think? Thomas shrugged, but there was less resistance in his posture. She has a kind smile, he admitted. Over the next few weeks, Zach and Thomas fell into a routine. Thomas would attend school while Zach worked on the ranch, building it up bit by bit. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, Zach teaching Thomas what he knew about cattle and horses, while Thomas, in turn, proudly showed Zach what he'd learned in school that day. It was during one of these evenings, as Thomas was reading aloud from his primer, that they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Zach's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he kept nearby, but he relaxed when he recognized Bridget Anderson guiding a small buggy. Evening, Miss Anderson, Zach called, standing as she pulled up to the fence. Good evening, Mr. Blackwood, Thomas. She smiled, and Zach felt that same strange fluttering in his chest. I hope I'm not intruding, but Thomas mentioned you were having some trouble with the arithmetic exercises I sent home. I wasn't having trouble, Thomas protested, his pride wounded. I just said Zach explained it different than you did. Bridget laughed, a sound that reminded Zach of the clear mountain streams he'd encountered in his travels. Well, I thought perhaps I could clarify things, and she hesitated, suddenly looking less sure of herself. I brought apple pie, my grandmother's recipe. Zach found himself smiling. Well, we'd be fools to turn down pie, wouldn't we, Thomas? Later, as they sat around the rough-hewn table Zach had built, Bridget watching approvingly as Thomas worked through his arithmetic problems, Zach realized how long it had been since he'd shared his table with anyone besides the boy. Longer still since he'd shared it with a woman as intriguing as Bridget Anderson. How long have you been teaching in Wildwood Creek? He asked as Thomas concentrated on a particularly challenging problem. 3 years now, she replied. I came west after. She paused, a shadow crossing her face. After some difficulties back east, teaching positions for women are limited there and I needed a fresh start. Zach nodded, recognizing the look of someone who'd left pain behind. The West is good for fresh starts. Yes, she agreed, meeting his eyes. I've found that to be true. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the efforts Zach had made to create a home. You've done well with this place, considering you've only been here a short while. It's coming along, Zach admitted. Though I reckon it's missing a woman's touch. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he felt heat rise to his face. Bridget's cheeks colored slightly as well, but she didn't look away. Perhaps it is, she said softly. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility, until Thomas announced triumphantly that he'd solved all his problems. As the weeks turned into months, Bridget became a regular visitor to the Blackwood Ranch. She brought books for Thomas, advice for Zach on how to make the cabin more comfortable, and always, her warm presence that made the place feel more like a home than Zach had ever thought possible. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing snow that piled high around the cabin. Thomas, now settled into life with Zach and excelling in school, delighted in the snow forts he built and the snowball fights he initiated whenever Zach had a spare moment. It was during one such moment, as Zach found himself laughing despite the cold, his face stinging from a well-aimed snowball, that he realized he couldn't imagine life without the boy anymore. Thomas had ceased to be a responsibility and had become something much more a son in all but name. That evening, as Thomas slept, exhausted from their day in the snow, Zach sat by the fire and penned a letter to the territorial judge, inquiring about the legal process of adoption. The boy's uncle in California had never been located, despite Zach's efforts. Thomas was, for all intents and purposes, alone in the world except for Zach. The knock at the door came just as he was sealing the envelope. He opened it to find Bridget standing there, snow dusting her coat and hat, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Bridget," he said, surprised. "It's dangerously cold out there. Come in, quickly." She stepped inside, removing her hat to reveal her hair falling loose around her shoulders. "I'm sorry to come so late, but school will be canceled tomorrow due to the storm, and I wanted to bring Thomas some books to keep him occupied." She held up a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Zach took the package, setting it on the table, but his eyes remained on Bridget. In the firelight, with her hair down and her eyes bright, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. "You're staring, Mr. Blackwood," she said, but there was a teasing quality to her voice. "Zach," he corrected softly. "After all these months, I think you can call me Zach," she smiled. "Zach, then." "You shouldn't try to go back to town tonight," he said, glancing toward the window where snow was falling heavily. "The storm's getting worse." Bridget bit her lip, looking uncertain. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You could take my bed," Zach offered quickly. "I'll sleep by the fire. It wouldn't be proper for you to risk your safety trying to get back to town." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Thank you. That's very kind." That night, as Zach lay on a bedroll near the fire, listening to the howling wind outside, he found himself thinking of the woman sleeping in his bed just a few feet away. Bridget Anderson had become important to him in ways he hadn't anticipated when they first met. She was kind, intelligent, and she genuinely cared for Thomas, qualities Zach valued more than he could express. And if he was honest with himself, which he tried to be on principle, he was falling in love with her. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. It had been many years since he'd allowed himself to care deeply for a woman. His life as a cowboy hadn't been conducive to romance. But now, with Thomas and the ranch, his life was changing. He was changing. Morning came with bright sunlight reflecting off the snow and the smell of coffee brewing. Zach opened his eyes to find Bridget moving quietly around the kitchen area, her hair once again neatly pinned up, though she was still wearing yesterday's dress. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. She turned, a smile lighting her face. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind I started coffee and breakfast. It seemed the least I could do after you gave up your bed." "I don't mind at all," Zach replied, sitting up. "Though you didn't have to do that. I wanted to." She poured a cup of coffee and brought it to him. Their fingers brushed as he took the cup, and neither pulled away immediately. The touch, simple as it was, sent warmth through Zach that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. "Bridget," he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say, but knowing he needed to say something. "Miss Anderson." "You're here," Thomas's excited voice interrupted as he bounded out of his small room. "Did you bring more books? Can we build another snow fort today?" Bridget laughed, breaking the moment between them. "Yes to both questions, Thomas, though the fort will have to wait until after breakfast." As they ate together, Zach couldn't help thinking how right it felt, the three of them around the table, laughing and talking as if they'd been doing it for years, instead of months. For the first time since finding Thomas crying at that fence, Zach allowed himself to envision a future not just for himself and the boy, but for Bridget too, if she wanted it. The storm kept Bridget at the ranch for 3 days. During that time, the three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm. They read books, played games Thomas had learned at school, and in the evenings, Zach taught Bridget how to play the harmonica he'd carried with him since his early days as a cowboy. On the third night, after Thomas had gone to bed, they sat by the fire, sharing stories of their lives before Wildwood Creek. Zach told her about his years on cattle drives, the sights he'd seen across the untamed West. Bridget, in turn, spoke of her life in Boston, the daughter of a professor who had encouraged her education despite society's limitations on women. "What really brought you west?" Zach asked gently, sensing there was more to her story than she'd shared previously. Bridget stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. I was engaged to be married, she said finally. To a man my father approved of, a colleague of his. He seemed kind, respectable. She took a deep breath. Until he wasn't. Zach's hands tightened on his coffee cup. Did he hurt you? Not physically, she assured him quickly. But I discovered he had other women. When I confronted him, he laughed, said once we were married I'd learn to look the other way as all good wives did. Her voice hardened. I broke the engagement that day. The scandal was significant. My father stood by me, but his position at the university was compromised. I couldn't stay and watch him suffer for my decision. So you came west, Zach said, understanding now. Yes, to teach, to be independent. To start fresh where no one knew me as that poor Anderson girl who was jilted, though in truth, I was the one who ended things. I'm sorry that happened to you, Zach said sincerely, but I can't say I'm sorry you ended up here. Bridget looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Neither am I. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Slowly giving her every chance to pull away, Zach reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, warm and steady. Bridget, he said softly, I'm not a fancy man. I don't have education like your father or his colleagues, but I know my own mind and heart. And they're both telling me the same thing, that you're a remarkable woman, and I'd be a fool not to tell you how I feel. Her breath caught, but her eyes remained steady on his. And how do you feel, Zachariah Blackwood? Like I've been waiting my whole life to meet you, he answered honestly. Like finding Thomas at that fence wasn't just about saving him, it was about leading me to you too. Bridget's free hand came up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. I've never met a man like you, she whispered. So honest, so good, the way you've cared for Thomas. It shows the kind of man you truly are. Zach turned his face slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. I'm writing to the judge about adopting Thomas officially, he told her. I want him to be my son in the eyes of the law, not just in my heart. Tears welled in Bridget's eyes. He's lucky to have found you. We found each other, Zach corrected gently. Just like you and I did. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Her lips were soft beneath his, her hand still warm in his grasp. It was a gentle kiss, respectful but filled with promise. When they finally broke apart, Bridget's cheeks were flushed, but her smile was radiant. I should probably go to bed, she said, though she made no move to release his hand. Probably, Zach agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment. The next morning, the road to town was finally clear enough for travel. Zach hitched up his wagon to take Bridget back, Thomas bouncing excitedly between them, oblivious to the changed atmosphere. As they approached the schoolhouse, Bridget turned to Thomas. Why don't you run inside and get the classroom fire started? The key is under the flower pot. Once Thomas was out of earshot, she turned to Zach. About last night. I meant every word, he said before she could continue, and I'd like to court you properly if you're willing. Relief and joy spread across her face. I'd like that very much. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing new life to the ranch. Zach had expanded the corral, added more cattle to his small herd, and with Thomas's help, planted a vegetable garden that Bridget had suggested. Their courtship had progressed steadily, with Bridget joining them for Sunday dinners after church, Zach escorting her to the town's occasional social events, and many quiet evenings on the porch after Thomas had gone to bed. The townsfolk had noticed. Of course, it was impossible not to in a place as small as Wildwood Creek, but the general reaction had been positive. The schoolteacher and the cowboy who'd taken in an orphan boy made a story everyone could appreciate. In late April, a letter arrived from the territorial judge. Zach read it with trembling hands, then whooped so loudly that Thomas came running from where he'd been feeding the chickens. What is it? What happened? The boy asked, eyes wide. Zach knelt down to his level, hands on his shoulders. The judge approved my petition, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If you want, Thomas, you can legally be my son, Thomas Blackwood. Thomas's mouth fell open, then his face split into the biggest smile Zach had ever seen. Really, I can be a Blackwood, like you. Like me, Zach confirmed, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Thomas threw his arms around Zach's neck, nearly knocking him over. Yes, I want that. That evening they rode into town to share the news with Bridget. She opened the door of her small house, surprise evident on her face at their unscheduled visit. Zach, Thomas, is everything all right, Miss Anderson? Thomas couldn't contain himself. I'm going to be a Blackwood, the judge said yes. Bridget's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes immediately filling with tears. Oh, Thomas, that's wonderful news. She looked to Zach, her expression soft with understanding of what this meant to him. We thought you should be the first to know, Zach said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. Come in, she urged, opening the door wider. This calls for celebration. I have lemonade and cookies. As Thomas darted past her into the house, Zach caught Bridget's hand. There's something else I wanted to ask you, he said quietly. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. Her eyes widened slightly. Zach, he took a deep breath. Bridget Anderson, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day at the schoolhouse. You've brought light and learning and laughter into our lives. I know it hasn't been that long, but when something's right, you just know it. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small ring simple with a single pearl. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of being a mother to Thomas? Of making our family complete? Tears spilled over onto Bridget's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. I love you, Zachariah Blackwood, you and Thomas both. From inside the house, Thomas's voice called out impatiently, Are you coming? The cookies are getting cold, they both laughed, the joy of the moment impossible to contain. Zach slipped the ring onto Bridget's finger, then kissed her softly, a promise of all the kisses to come. We're coming, son, he called back, taking Bridget's hand. Together, they stepped into the house and into their future. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Wildwood Creek. Thomas stood proudly at Zach's side, holding the rings on a small pillow Bridget had embroidered. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which spilled from the church into the street and eventually to the saloon, where even the most respectable ladies ventured for this special occasion. Bridget wore a dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Zach, in the only suit he owned, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. Thomas, in a new shirt and suspenders, bounced on his toes with excitement. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zach kissed Bridget with a tenderness that belied the passion he felt. Then, together, they knelt down to Thomas's level. We're a family now, Zach said, his voice rough with emotion. The three of us forever. Thomas's eyes were bright with unshed tears of joy. Forever, he repeated solemnly. Bridget moved into the ranch house the next day, bringing with her books, colorful quilts, and the warmth that Zach had known the place was missing. Within weeks, she had transformed the cabin into a true home, curtains at the windows, a proper dining table to replace Zach's rough-hewn one, and flowers growing in pots along the porch. She continued teaching, riding to and from town each day, often with Thomas alongside her. In the evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, talking about their days. Sometimes Zach would play his harmonica while Bridget sang songs she remembered from her childhood in Boston. As summer turned to fall, Bridget shared news that made their happiness complete. She was expecting a child. A baby. Thomas's eyes were wide with wonder. I'm going to be a big brother? Yes, Bridget confirmed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Around springtime, we think. Thomas immediately began making plans where the baby would sleep, what he would teach his new sibling, how he would protect them from any dangers. Zach watched his son's excitement with amusement and pride, then turned to his wife. Are you happy? He asked softly, taking her hand. Bridget's smile was answer enough, but she spoke anyway. Happier than I ever thought possible. When I came west, I was running away from pain. I never imagined I'd find such joy. Winter came again, harsher than the previous year. Bridget's belly grew round with their child, and Zach found himself watching her with a mixture of awe and concern. The nearest doctor was in Cheyenne, a long journey in good weather, impossible in winter storms. But Bridget remained strong and healthy, her face glowing with the new life within her. She and Thomas spent the snowbound days reading together, working on his lessons and preparing for the baby. Zach expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Thomas and a small nursery adjacent to their own room. In early April, just as the last snow was melting, their daughter arrived. The town's midwife, Mrs. Peterson, helped with the delivery while Thomas and Zach paced anxiously outside. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, Zach felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. "You have a beautiful daughter, Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Peterson announced, opening the door to admit him. Bridget lay exhausted but radiant in their bed, a small bundle cradled in her arms. When Zach approached, she pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with a tuft of dark hair. "She has your hair," Bridget said softly. Zach gently touched his daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. "She's perfect," he whispered, "just like her mother." Thomas crept in behind Zach, his eyes huge. "Can I see her?" Bridget beckoned him closer. "Come meet your sister, Thomas." The boy approached cautiously, then broke into a wide smile when the baby's tiny hand closed around his finger. "She's so small," he breathed. "What's her name?" Zach and Bridget exchanged a look. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. "What do you think we should call her?" Zach asked his son. Thomas considered the question seriously. "Hope," he said finally. "Because that's what you gave me when you found me at the fence, and now we can give it to her too." Bridget's eyes filled with tears. "Hope Blackwood," she said, testing the name. "It's beautiful." "Hope it is," Zach agreed, his heart so full he thought it might burst. As the years passed, the Blackwood family thrived. The ranch expanded, becoming one of the most successful in the county. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's thirst for knowledge. Hope, with her father's dark hair and her mother's quick mind, became the light of their lives. 2 more children joined the family, another daughter, Grace, and finally a son they named William, after Bridget's father back in Boston. The old professor eventually made the journey west to meet his grandchildren, reconciling with the daughter who had fled scandal years before. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, Zach and Bridget would often sit on the porch, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars appear over the land they loved. "Did you ever imagine this life?" Bridget asked one such evening, 20 years after they'd first met. "When you found Thomas crying at that fence," Zach shook his head, looking at the thriving ranch, the home they'd built together. "Never," he admitted. "I was just trying to do the right thing for a boy who needed help. I never imagined he'd lead me to you, to all of this." Bridget turned her face up to his, the years having only added character to her beauty. "The best things in life are often the ones we never saw coming." Zach kissed her then, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. "I love you, Bridget Blackwood," he murmured against her lips. "As much now as the day I married you." "And I love you," she replied, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "My cowboy with the gentle heart." From inside the house came the soft wail of their newest grandchild, born to Thomas and his wife just a month earlier. Bridget smiled. "The next generation needs us," she said, rising from her seat. Zach watched her go, thinking of the lonely cowboy he'd been, the orphan boy at the fence, and the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this moment. Love, he had learned, could begin in the most unexpected places, even with tears at a fence post and the simple words, "Come with me, son." And in that moment, as he had countless times before, Zach sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the day he'd decided to stop his horse and speak to a weeping child the decision that had led him to the greatest love and the fullest life he could have ever imagined.